word of introduction first about our distinguished guest. Often described as Africa's optimist-in-chief, Dr. Adesina has been widely praised for his visionary leadership and passion for the transformation of Africa. Since he took over as president of the AfDB in 2015, the bank has achieved the highest capital increase since its establishment in 1964. Let me open our conversation, Dr. Adesina, by asking you just a couple of general questions about the work of the bank. You are responsible for having conceived the so-called high five priorities, the strategic priorities for the bank. Could you tell us a little bit about how you see these priorities helping African countries to take forward the work of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals?
The high fives that you mentioned, David, at the bank, I like 5 things. So the 5 things that we started off was called high fives: light up and power Africa, to feed Africa, to industrialize Africa, to integrate Africa, and to improve the quality of life of the people of Africa. Well, it looks pretty simple, like you're doing high fives for everybody else, but in fact, they are very, very powerful. You know, the United Nations Development Program did an independent assessment, and they found out that, you know, if Africa were to achieve these high fives, it will have achieved 90% of the Sustainable Development Goals. In essence, David, the African Development Bank's high fives are the accelerators of Africa's development. We've been able to connect 21 million people in terms of access to new electricity connections. You take a look at agriculture, for example. We've been able to get 79 million people with access to, 76 million people with access to improve agricultural technologies for food security. Now, finance is very, very important. And so we do quite a lot of investments in investee companies on the access to finance. And our work on that has improved the access to finance for 12 million people. Now, when you take off infrastructure is one of the big things the bank does. We've invested more than $40 billion on infrastructure in the last 7 years alone. You know, so our work on transport, for example, has provided access to 69 million people in terms of access to improved transport services. And when you look at urbanization in Africa, the whole issue of water and sanitation is a very big issue. And our work has provided access to 50 million people with access to improved water and sanitation in that short period of time. You know, last year, the African Development Bank was ranked by Global Finance as the best multilateral financial institution in the world.
Those are remarkable achievements, and indeed in such a short space of time under your leadership. Obviously, right now there are clouds on the horizon. I mean, big clouds, and notably the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. How do you see the repercussions of that conflict in terms of food security in Africa, food access? What scale of crisis do you think is heading towards the continent?
Africa depends on Russia and Ukraine a lot. If you look at it, you know, in terms of wheat, you know, both wheat supply, Ukraine and Russia and Ukraine supply 41% of Africa's wheat supply, right? And if there's no wheat, basically for many places, there's no food. Africa will not be getting 2 million metric tons of fertilizer coming from both countries. Now, if those fertilizers don't come in, basically what that means, David, is that productivity on existing cultivated land in Africa will decline by anything between 20% and 50%. Right? So you have the one of food not coming in, and you have the reduction in your productivity on existing land. So whichever way you look at both of those two things, that confluence of those two factors will actually lead to a looming food crisis in Africa. But here is where we have been very, very quick to respond to this. We launched a $1.5 billion African emergency food production plan to help Africa to produce and compensate for what is not going to be getting from those countries. Now, this $1.5 billion emergency food production facility will allow Africa to produce 38 million metric tons of food. So I am confident, because our plan is based on what has been working. We'll have to take that to scale, but I think it's also an opportunity for us to finally do what we should have done a long time ago, a real deep structural transformation to unlock the full potential of Africa's when COVID-19 actually hit, it was a real eye-opener for me because Africa did not have even basic gloves. It didn't have access to personal protective equipment. It did not have access to testing kits. It did not even have access to laboratories. There was only one or two in Africa that could actually test for things. And if you look at the number of ICU beds that were there, very, very, very little. So Africa was totally unprepared. Africa must learn some deep lessons from this crisis, build Africa's pharmaceutical capacity, manufacturing capacity. Second is to build Africa's vaccine manufacturing capacity. And third is to build what you were saying, the whole issue of quality healthcare infrastructure. Africa imports about 70–80% of all its drugs and medicines and so on. You know, it doesn't make any sense. And so we've committed to spend $3 billion over the next 10 years in helping to revamp Africa's pharmaceutical industries. But we want to move beyond that and be able to master the processes, the knowledge, the know-how that allows Africa to produce vaccines for its own epidemiological profile.
How does it work, for example, with countries in the Sahel, which have internal political insecurity and might have difficulties in making the best use of the financing that the bank provides? But if you could tell us a little bit about the climate work that and take up Francis' question, that would be great.
Okay. Now let me talk first on the climate side. You know, I mean, climate change is a real problem for Africa. You know, Africa doesn't contribute for more than 4% of the carbon emissions in the world, but suffers disproportionately from the negative consequences of it. You have on the continent today in Africa, we lose anything between $7 and $15 billion a year in terms of losses to climate change. Now, if nothing changes going forward, that's going to rise to $50 billion a year by 2030. So that's really going to be almost 7% of Africa's GDP going into that. So it's a massive problem that it has created. Now, the issue is Africa needs to adapt to climate change, right? So a lot of focus has to be on climate adaptation. And that's where our priority is. As a bank today, we have doubled our climate finance to reach $25 billion by 2025. Now, a big chunk of that is actually focused on climate adaptation. You know, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that, you know, the world's institutions, which will all focus on 50-50 in terms of adaptation and climate mitigation. Well, we've gone beyond 50% as African Development Bank. We are at 67% of all our climate finance devoted to climate adaptation, which is Africa's challenge. So which is the highest of any multilateral financial institution you will find in the world. I was very delighted when the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres listed the African Development Bank as the leader globally on climate adaptation and said, others will follow. So we continue to work on climate adaptation. The Sahel, three things I want to say about the Sahel. The first is that Sahel needs electricity. You know, and as you know, Sahel faces a challenge with regard to the issue of also insecurity, which is one thing. And the other thing, of course, is desertification. So if you take a look at the issue of access to electricity in the Sahel, the bank is implementing what is called desert to power, turning these deserts, harnessing the power of the sun to provide them electricity. It's a $20 billion program that we're working on. We're working on it together with the Agence Française de Développement in France, who's put together 100 million euros support for it. We have the Rockefeller Foundation that's committed $100 million towards that. We have the Global Environment and the Green Climate Fund that has just put in $150 million towards that effort. The Swedish government has put in 20 million euros in support of that initiative, and the bank is putting well over $400 million through our Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa into that. Well, what will the desert to power do? Not just for the Sahelian countries, but for all the countries that share the Sahelian band in Africa, all the way to Djibouti, all the way to northern Ethiopia. What will it do? It will provide electricity. 10,000 megawatts of electricity is the capacity we want to build via solar. And that will provide electricity for 250 million people, both grid-based and off-grid-based systems. And when it is completed, it will be the largest solar zone in the world. Unfortunately, insecurity has increased significantly across the Sahel, as you know. We have to now make a link between security, between growth, between security linking it to investment, to growth and development. We can't look at security anymore as an exogenous factor in that development process. We've got to integrate it as an endogenous part of that. And to deal with that and help the countries to have more resources to cope with these issues of insecurity that is now becoming a contagion effect in many countries with spillover effects, the African Development Bank is developing what's called security index investment bonds. And these security index investment bonds will be new instruments that we will launch on the capital markets that will allow these countries of the Sahel and others to do four things. First is to build up their defense architecture. I don't mean guns, I don't mean APCs or anything like that, but just your intelligence, your human capacity, your ICT systems and so on, surveillance systems, which is very important. And second is to rebuild damaged infrastructure in areas of conflict. Third is to rebuild social infrastructure, water, health, education, in areas that have been devastated, because if you don't have those, then you've lost the battle of the mind and soul of the population. And the last one is to also protect areas where you have strategic investments from terrorists and others doing that. So we are trying to do that to support them to be more stable economies. And lastly is the whole issue of the climate, the issue of desertification is a big problem in the Sahel. And that's why I really want to applaud the work that's been led by President Macron in France, and also with the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and my sister, Amina Mohammed, there on the Great Green Wall. Because the Great Green Wall is the buffer to protect the Sahel from desertification. And the African Development Bank is a champion of that, and we committed $6.5 billion towards that Great Green Wall. So at the end of the day, all I'm saying is we've got to help the Sahelian economies to be more stable climate-wise, reduce desertification, but also make sure that they have more resources to cope with the issues of rising expenditures that are making on the military, which is actually reducing and displacing, let me say, the financing going to development. So any economy without electricity is not a living economy. It's not a dynamic economy. It's not one that can create job or industrialize and things like that, and be competitive. And that's why Light Up and Power Africa is a major, a top priority for us in Africa. Today, 84% of all of our investment in energy in Africa is focused on renewable energy. So for example, we actually help to finance the New Ouazzazate, which is the world's largest concentrated solar power plant, which is 510 megawatts, which is based in Morocco. The second one is we did the 310 megawatts, which is in Lake Turkana project, which is in Kenya, which is the largest wind power plant in Africa. But we are also investing in geothermal. So geothermal, for example, in the area that were in Kenya, in the Rift Valley area, that geothermal now supplies more than 60% of the electricity of Kenya. We are also investing in hydro. So basically, but as we look at energy, with all of that I've just mentioned to you, we must also realize that three things are fundamentally important. One is access, second is affordability, and third is security and stability of supply. So for Africa, yes, we're doing all we can on the renewable side, but there are limits to what renewable alone can do because of the intermittency of the power supply. And so for Africa, natural gas is and must remain a fundamental part of the energy mix of Africa. What you need is an energy mix. By actually doing that, we ensure that we actually have a stable grid system that can allow us to take advantage of the maximum we can out of renewable energy. Because fundamentally, what we're doing is we are establishing at the bank a just energy transition facility, which will warehouse the heavy fuel oil power plants in Africa, the coal-based power plants in Africa, and transition them to much more grid-based, renewable energy-based that are less polluting for the environment. We develop a new financial business model, investment model, that will allow us working together with the G7 on their grants, on their concessions, and also on guarantees to turn that $8.7 billion into $40 billion, which is what South Africa will need in hand to be able to actually do a just energy transition properly. And I must add, the business model we have will allow South Africa to raise all that money without incurring debt at all.
Infrastructure, could you just tell us very, very quickly what your priorities are there? The work which the bank is doing to support the creation of infrastructure, and indeed, what are your thoughts on the Chinese dimension?
In the last 7 years, we've invested in infrastructure well over $40 billion on infrastructure. Because we focus a lot on infrastructure. And that infrastructure includes, for example, road transport corridors, energy infrastructure, digital infrastructure, but also water and sanitation to cope with rapidly urbanizing societies like we have in Africa. And including energy transmission infrastructure. So if I can give you one or two key infrastructure that is actually transforming the continent. Take, for example, the transport corridor that is linking Ethiopia, Addis Ababa to Nairobi. And so it provides, it's a $1.1 billion investment by the bank, over 1,100 kilometers. And it's almost completed. When it's completed, David, it will allow trade between Ethiopia and Kenya to rise by 400%. You take, for example, another type of infrastructure, which is very, very important, which is port infrastructure. You look at the Walvis Bay port in Namibia, for example, we put about $380 million into that. And that will reduce the cost of accessing port for the landlocked countries, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Zambia and all that, that are going to use that port because of the increased capacity of the port. Digital economy is where we are today. And so you do need to have digital infrastructure. So the bank has invested a lot in this digital infrastructure, submarine cables in East Africa and Central Africa, and the Trans-Sahara submarine network to link us all the way to North Africa and then into Europe, which is very, very important for all the digital services that one is talking about today. And if I may also add one thing, is just at the Africa Investment Forum that we had just this year, the big corridor that's supposed to link Lagos to Abidjan, going through Benin and going to Accra and all the way to Abidjan, and of course, eventually up to Senegal. We were able to raise roughly $15.6 billion of investment commitment from investors towards that project that will be landmark in the region. So there are many, many types of infrastructure that we are doing. But three things I want to say on infrastructure. First is that as we do infrastructure, we must recognize that governments alone cannot and should not do infrastructure. Because if governments get debt, and the debt is, if you look at a lot of the debt Africa has today, it's quite a lot of it is infrastructure related debt. Okay, but if government is putting all of that in its own books, that's not necessarily good. So we believe that it's time to do a lot more public-private partnerships on infrastructure to make sure that we reduce the debt overhang that comes from infrastructure. Secondly, is the importance of also making sure that infrastructure is quality infrastructure, not just any kind of infrastructure. So we have had a lot of the G20 principles on quality infrastructure, because you have to look at the life cycle costs and maintenance costs of infrastructure, quality infrastructure. And that's why, and environmentally climate resilient infrastructure. And that's why the African Development Bank, ourselves, Africa 50, the European Investment Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and several other agencies are launching, and with the Agence Conseil de Développement in France, where we are launching what is called the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, to allow Africa to raise a lot of green bonds to finance green climate resilient infrastructure. And the last thing I want to say on infrastructure, which is particularly important, is that if there is one type of infrastructure that I don't like and I will never subscribe to, it's infrastructure that is built with natural resources backing the loans, right? Mm-hmm. That's very, very bad type of loans. You cannot mortgage your future just because you want to get something in the immediate. And so we must make sure that investments on infrastructure are done transparently and done in a way that does not undermine the long-term financial viability of of countries. You know, people talk about, you asked me a question about China. China does a lot of investments on infrastructure in Africa. But I do want to say that the issue you find in Africa is that Africa just basically needs infrastructure. And it needs quality infrastructure. What I think we need to do, regardless of where the financing is coming, is agree on a number of common principles. First is that we must agree that there must be quality infrastructure. Two, we must agree that we must not let infrastructure lead to increased debt burdens for countries. We must also make sure that we also do local currency financing of infrastructure. Because if you do a road, transport corridors, and or energy and your revenue stream currency, or you're paying for it with expensive foreign debt, well, there's a currency mismatch problem there. And so we want to make sure we do a lot more on local currency financing.
Thank you for everything you told us today.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ryan. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks,
Bye.